Hello students, this is a quick part 2. If you are just tuning in, make sure that you watch part 1, which talks about Mexican independence and the Mexican-American War. The reason why I want to do a part 2 is for the sake of your eyes, for the sake of your sanity with distance learning. I want us to limit our screen time and break these up into pieces. So I want to keep these videos 10 minutes or less until the end of the year. So let's talk about what happened after the Mexican-American War. If you remember from the previous video, you know that Mexico lost that war. They signed a peace treaty where they ceded is spelled with a C, they ceded territory to the United States. That was called the Mexican Cession. Cession with a C. To cede land means to give up land, typically in the aftermath of a war. Okay, so after the Mexican Cession, and by the way, the Mexican Cession was about half of the size of what Mexico was prior to the war. So translation, Mexico lost approximately 50% of its territory after the war. So that helps you understand why the period after the Mexican-American War was a period of instability. Imagine what it would be like to lose this much land, regardless of what the population of that land was. Furthermore, the very year after that peace treaty was signed was the beginning of the gold rush, rather. So gold was discovered in the Sacramento River Valley, I believe, was the specific location. And then after that, that triggered the gold rush. So consider, remember, it was a $15 million purchase. Think about how much more that land could have been worth if they had known there was gold there. Okay, so let's talk about how different ideologies in the state of Mexico think about the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. Okay, so I'm going to talk about liberals and I'm going to talk about conservatives here, but it's important for you to understand exactly what we mean by liberals. So I asked this twice in this slide. So the simple definition of what a liberal meant, at least in this context, was that liberals largely made up the middle class of Mexico. So you might, as you listen, say, hey, that's not what liberal means, right? Liberal means to the left. Liberal means people who maybe encapsulate a combination of maybe they're the middle class, maybe they're the wealthy elite, like many celebrities are considered liberals in the United States, and maybe they are the working class. That's not what liberal means in the 19th century. Okay, liberalism, regardless of where we were in Western society, this was largely a Western ideal, liberals meant not just middle class, but they also largely excluded the working class, for better or for worse. Okay, liberals were intellectuals. Think about the Enlightenment thinkers from Global Studies 1 last year. Those were liberals. Can you think of any poor Enlightenment philosophers off the top of your head? Okay, so in any event, that's what liberal means in this context. So it's important for you to understand that there were many Mexican citizens who were not included in this category. And the most important, at least in my opinion, or rather there are two really, the most important groups that we need to consider here, and they overlap to an extent, they are people who live in rural Mexico. They are the agricultural working people who stand to lose a considerable amount of land. And within that category are indigenous Mexicans. So who descended from I don't want to use the phrase Native American because that's not their preferred term, but people who were already in the Americas before European colonization, I should say. There were over 6 million indigenous Mexicans who were forced, with no choice involved in the matter, to sell their land. They had communal land plots typically. They did not believe in private property ownership, but they had no choice here because liberal reform also valued property ownership. Think about how John Locke said life, liberty, and property. So this was out of their hands. They lost their land, and an agricultural life was what they had been practicing for thousands of years. So many of them were forced to migrate to cities in search of new work. Another thing that we need to consider is that there was a major civil war in the late 1850s, early 1860s. Interestingly, that overlaps at least slightly with the United States Civil War, but I don't believe that was a coincidence, just an interesting tidbit there, because the American Civil War started in 1861. So the result of that Civil War, it actually was adopted in the middle of that Civil War. In fact, it was rather adopted at the beginning of that Civil War. And there's a typo here, so I'll change it. It's 1858 because that is also the year that Juarez was elected president. I'll talk about that in a second. So the Civil War was largely an ideological civil war. Okay, so the war was between the conservatives, who largely were made up of religious leaders, and military leaders. The Constitution that resulted from the talks at the beginning of this Civil War was rejected by conservatives, and it was accepted by liberals. Liberals ended up winning this Civil War, and in the process of the Civil War, before it even ended, they elected Benito Juarez as president, and he remained president. Here's another typo. Oh my goodness. He remained president until 1876, not 1872, and that was the year of his death. And Juarez introduced a number of new economic reforms, and many of them involved the increase in foreign investment. And this is really important. When we say foreign investment, we mean other countries investing in the Mexican economy. And the most significant country that really ramped up its investment in the Mexican economy was the United States. So hopefully that made sense to you. That is a really important item for us to consider when we come back right now to talk about the roots of the Mexican Revolution. So let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.